Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. The governments of Turkey and the Netherlands announced that they have agreed to normalize ties in a joint statement today.
Turkey and Netherlands have agreed to normalize ties, both foreign ministries said in a joint statement today. The decision was reached in a phone call between Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu and his Dutch counterpart Stef Blok, the statement said. During the telephone conversation, the ministers agreed to normalize the diplomatic relations between the Netherlands and Turkey. To that extent, the ministers agreed to reinstate ambassadors in Ankara and The Hague shortly. The ministers also agreed that the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs will pay an official visit to Turkey in the second half of 2018, said the joint statement. Relations between the Netherlands and Turkey have gone especially sour after Dutch authorities cancelled the flight permit of a plane carrying Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu during last year's referendum campaign in March 2017. The Dutch government also expelled Turkey's Family and Social Affairs Minister Fatma Betül Sayankaya from Rotterdam, blocking her from addressing the Turkish community. The Dutch Foreign Ministry on February 5th had said it had formally withdrawn its ambassador to Turkey, who has been physically barred from the country for almost a year.
Tonight, we're joined by Berk Esen in the studio. Esen is an assistant professor of international relations at Bilkent University in Ankara. His research interests include state building, democratization, and authoritarian regimes in Latin America and the Middle East, and we'll be speaking about the current state and the future of the opposition in Turkey following the June 24th elections. Good evening, Berk. Good to have you here.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So before we start talking about the opposition, first and foremost, let's start with a question from your research area, perhaps a theoretical one, but implications from current events in Turkey, perhaps. Is Turkey an authoritarian regime?
Well, I mean, in my own research, I classify Turkey as a competitive authoritarian regime, quite possibly since the 2010 referendum, a referendum that basically curbed the autonomy and independence of the judiciary. So since 2010, Turkey has very rapidly experienced a democratic backsliding. And the current regime that Turkey is in is competitive in the sense that we still have political parties that contest power through elections, and winning elections are the only way to come to power. But the regime is authoritarian in the sense that the state apparatus is now completely dominated by the ruling party, and the partisan way in which the state bureaucracy and the public resources are used and distributed create a very uneven playing field between the opposition parties and the ruling party. And so even though the opposition parties can contest the elections and theoretically have a chance to win the elections, their chances of, in practice, their chances of winning elections is becoming minimal over time.
So you've mentioned the year 2010, which happens to be a critical year in which a very important, a very key referendum took place. Perhaps you would get to that in a bit, but in comparison with its near past, how should one make sense of Turkey's new era and its current political climate?
Well, basically, since the after the 2017 referendum, which significantly increased the powers of the presidency in the Turkish political system, we have witnessed a dramatic institutional change. Powers that were for more than a century enjoyed by the Turkish parliament or the Ottoman Turkish parliament have shifted to the hands of the president. In order to create a strong presidency or a strong presidential regime, we will probably in the coming weeks and months are going to see a major overhaul of the state apparatus. So that's one thing that we can easily suggest. And so the current competitive authoritarian regime that we have does not really rely on a very strong ruling party, as it used to be the case since 2002, but in fact, it's based on neo-patrimonial rule, some kind of a sultanistic regime in which the president has accumulated significant amount of power.
And let's get to the opposition now, which happens to be our main focus tonight. So what exactly is going on with the opposition in Turkey at the moment? As a political scientist, what's your overall evaluation of the current performance and state of the opposition?
Well, I think they have a rather mixed sort of balance. Opposition parties under authoritarian regimes experience major difficulty. Obviously, there is an uneven playing field. The ruling party has structural advantages, and so there is a high cost to being in the opposition, which is why, of course, it becomes very difficult to really resist or to stay in the opposition against these regimes. So I think we need to, first of all, acknowledge that fact. Because of that reason, in similar kind of authoritarian regimes, not just in Turkey, but in other countries, we see the opposition to be divided. And that is certainly the case in Turkey. We have seen the opposition try to engage in some kind of strategic coordination before the election so that they will have boosted powers. But of course, that's a very, very challenging act. So the opposition is somewhat divided. In addition to that, of course, the opposition has had difficulty recruiting candidates that have significant amount of popularity or talent. So the opposition faces resource disadvantages, an uneven playing field, as a result of which has difficulty finding credible candidates who will be able to challenge the ruling party, and on top of that is divided along ideological lines. Mm-hmm.
And when looking at the opposition as a whole, which is made up of different components, different political components, very different ones actually, obviously, how would you situate the main opposition, Republican People's Party, the People's Democratic Party, the pro-Kurdish HDP, and the very newly established İYİ Party, Good Party, under the chairwomanship of Meral Akşener?
Well, basically, for the last 25 years, Turkish politics has been structured along three main cleavages. And I think the existing party system has been created as a result of these three cleavages. The first one is obviously the left-right cleavage that you see in modern democracies, as well as obviously in Turkey since the 1960s. But starting from the 1980s, we have seen the rise of a Turkish versus Kurdish nationalist cleavage, which creates a second sort of dividing line, and because of that reason, of course, parties are structured along both a center-left, center-right division, a Kurdish nationalist, Turkish nationalist division, as well as a secular Islamist sort of division. The main opposition party tends to draw most of its votes from secular, urban, center-left voters. The HDP has drawn much of its vote share from the Kurdish nationalist voters living in southeastern provinces of the country, eastern and southeastern provinces. But of course, in addition to that, for the last few years, we have seen a growing number of leftist and socialist Turkish voters who live in coastal areas and major metropolitan areas throw their support behind HDP. İYİ Party, on the other hand, has been a newcomer, has been a new party that emerged only a few months ago. And they sort of fall somewhere between somewhat of a conservative, but also a centrist/nationalist party, receiving a lot of support from major cities, not only very urban areas, but also mid-sized cities. And so it's located somewhere between CHP and MHP. Of course, MHP tends to get a lot of support from the right-wing Anatolian heartland. And AKP is obviously an increasingly conservative Islamist party to the right of the political spectrum. So this is how the parties are structured in the party system currently.
So let's reshift our focus from the opposition to the government or the governing body, rather, for a moment now. When speaking in your previous responses, you've talked about Turkey resembling a competitive authoritarian regime and how this was founded within the theoretical literature, but surely this phenomenon isn't on the rise only in Turkey at the moment. What other examples can we talk about in comparison with Turkey right now? Is this phenomenon on the rise elsewhere? And if yes, where and how?
Well, certainly. I mean, Turkey at the moment is not really an anomaly. And what we've seen in Turkey, quite possibly since 2010, is a reflection of what's going on in the rest of the developing world, in particular parts of Latin America and Eastern Europe, where we have seen the rise of, for instance, in the case of Venezuela, a very left-wing populist party that has come to power in the late 1990s and have over time become more and more authoritarian. So that's sort of one possible case that we can compare Turkey with. Of course, the other two cases that I can think of that are actually even more similar to the Turkish case are the two right-wing populist parties that have come to power in Eastern Europe, in particular in Hungary and Poland. These cases resemble AKP in the sense that they are quite conservative, maybe not in a very religiously sort of base, but rather a nativistic sort of nationalist base. These are parties that have won elections. In the case of Hungary, which is where my research is located, the Fidesz party had come to power in 2010 elections with a 2/3 majority, very similar to what AKP had in 2002. And since then, after capturing the parliament, they began to capture the state apparatus, govern it in a very, very partisan fashion, and then they ended up passing legislations that increased the power of the ruling party, in particular creating a very strong prime ministry. The ruling party now distributes resources, in particular public resources, but also private resources, in a very partisan way to divide the opposition. And so the opposition has been substantially weakened. And another structural similarity between the two countries, Poland is now joining these two cases as well in this particular point, and that is the partisan capture of the judiciary. The Fidesz, much like what has happened in this country, have classified or have portrayed the Constitutional Court, the judges serving in the Constitutional Court, as well as rest of the judiciary branch, as leftovers from the previous authoritarian regime. In the case of Hungary, they've accused these judges to be rather die-hard supporters of the old communist system, much like how AKP has portrayed the judges in Turkey as vestiges of the Kemalist, old Kemalist system. And by using this angle, they ended up changing the judiciary and make the judiciary come under very strong partisan control. So a very weak parliament, completely dominated by the ruling party, no institutional checks and balances left, and a very partisan judiciary make Turkey, what is going on currently in Turkey, very similar to Hungary and Poland, with one major caveat, or with one major difference, and that is, unlike those two cases, we are seeing a dramatic personalization of power under the office of the presidency in the Turkish case. So the ruling party is now withering, its support base is eroding, and instead we are seeing the rise of a very charismatic leadership around the persona of Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
And how does the opposition in these other examples, other countries, compare to Turkey at the moment?
Well, actually, ironically, the opposition in these two countries, particularly Hungary and Poland, have done actually a much worse job than the opposition in Turkey. The opposition in Hungary is quite divided. So divided that the Hungarian Socialist Party, the main opposition party, the center-left party that one could compare Turkey's CHP, Republican People's Party, have completely splintered. It lost its vote share. In the most recent election, their vote share came beneath the 20% mark, to such an extent that the far-right opposition party, Jobbik, which in some ways is comparable to MHP, have become more prominent than the Hungarian Socialist Party. So what we're seeing in Hungary is a complete dissolution of the opposition parties, with EU just watching the developments with worry, but no activism whatsoever. In fact, the opposition seems to be in a slightly better shape in Turkey.
So you've talked about Poland and Hungary, and you've mentioned how the opposition in these countries are currently performing worse than their counterparts in Turkey. But surely there must be some disadvantages and limitations facing Turkey's opposition bloc at the moment. What are these?
Well, there's several. First of all, obviously, the media system has, in these two countries, not to the same extent, but certainly in Turkey, the media system has come under the strong control of the ruling party, the AKP. And so the opposition parties, in particular the main opposition party, has obviously had difficulty outreaching to or reaching out to the voters, because if you cannot control the media, then obviously you gain very little representation in the media, and so even if you have credible people to criticize the government's agenda, you have no access to the voters. So that's one problem. The other problem is, of course, it has become increasingly costlier to be in the opposition in Turkey, and so very talented. So as a result of which, the opposition parties has had major difficulties recruiting credible professional candidates. In other words, candidates who would be popular with the public, but who have their own individual areas of expertise. Law, economics, different aspects of politics, whatever. And so the opposition parties can't really recruit good talent, which leaves them under the control of very small circles, in particular what we see in current CHP's leadership. Difficulty of finding representation in the media, no outreach, and obviously an uneven playing field, particularly caused by the fact that the ruling party controls both the state bureaucracy and the state budget, and especially during campaign time, can use these public resources in a way that would benefit the agenda and the campaign of the ruling party. So in many ways, what we've seen in the current, in the most recent campaign, the opposition parties have run against not only AKP, but the entire state apparatus.
And can we talk about any advantages or opportunities that are currently in the cards for the opposition in Turkey? Because so far we've talked about the difficulties and limitations, and what's in the cards in the upside, let's say?
Well, the opposition has, I think, several structural advantages, and we can maybe also talk about where Turkey may be headed given its structural factors. But the opposition has several structural advantages. One, when you look at the voter base of the opposition, in particular the main opposition party, obviously it relies on a very educated workforce. Educated workforce with some means of income. So in other words, the opposition parties, in particular CHP, does not really need to distribute resources the same way that AKP does in order to draw voters. To go to the voting booth to support the opposition party, the main opposition party, because the main opposition party relies on a much more of an educated workforce. Obviously, this voter base can mobilize itself in an autonomous fashion without needing any kind of encouragement from the opposition party. The same electorate we've seen during the Gezi protests, we've seen during the most recent campaign, as well as during the 2017 referendum, can use the social media very effectively. So even if the national media is completely dominated by the ruling party, without the opposition parties doing much, the social media is already dominated by the opposition's voter base. That obviously is a huge advantage. And lastly, especially over the last few years, what we've seen is that the current ruling party in Turkey has tried to intervene to the lifestyles of opposition, members of the opposition. And so increasingly so, what we're seeing is that those with a modern lifestyle are automatically shifting their support to the opposition. Because of the very conservative cultural and educational agenda of the ruling party seems not to be in sync with the modern age. And obviously, Turkey having a very young, educated population, or at least a young population that is becoming increasingly more educated, it's going to make it more and more difficult over time for the ruling party to retain this young electorate, giving a structural advantages to the opposition parties, particularly the main opposition party, if it can use its resources effectively.
So let's conclude on a note, let's say, which resembles more of a policy advice than an analysis. Let's say, so far we've focused on structural explanations, but what kind of an agency do you think can the opposition have under these circumstances? In other words, what can the opposition do?
Well, the opposition can do several things. In particular, the main opposition party, but also the other two parties, for instance, E-Party. First of all, competitive authoritarian regimes have a degree of uncertainty. Because the regimes are competitive, the ruling parties in these kind of systems can easily lose an election. Well, not easily, but can lose an election. There's a chance of the ruling party losing an election. This is not a very closed political system. And so the reason why competitive authoritarian regimes survive in different parts of the world, and what we've seen also in Turkey over the last few years, is that the opposition is divided and the ruling party can take away the hope of the opposition, members of the opposition, right? There is no chance of winning an election. We face an uphill battle. There is an uneven playing field. Why even bother? So the opposition parties, first of all, first and foremost, has to spread around hope. They have to give hope to the opposition voters that the elections are real, that they have real chances of winning these elections, right? So the key message here is hope. Now, there are several ways with which the opposition parties, in particular in this case CHP, can distribute such hope. First of all, recruit good candidates. Candidates that know, that have clear areas of expertise, that will be able to convey to the rest of the public that they will be able to get the job done much better than the ruling party. And especially candidates that are popular with the public, with the electorate in their own local areas. That's one very key thing that they can do. Second, they have to reorganize their organization. Right? If the national media is off limits and cannot really be used by the opposition, if the opposition is running against the entire state apparatus, the main resource that they have is their organization. Right? They have to rely on their local organization to reach out to the voters, to get them out to the voting booth on the election day. So that's another thing that they can very clearly do. And connecting those 2 points, they need to come up with a very, very popular candidate, right, who will convey in a very credible fashion the message that he or she can win the election, and together with the popular candidate, creative ways with which the opposition can run their campaign. Right? Reaching out to young voters, using social media, innovative and cheap ways that will change the balance, the uneven playing field that is against the opposition. These are some key agency factors that can easily be changed for the opposition.
Thank you very much, Berk Esen, for joining us in the studio tonight and for your comments.
Thank you.
We'll continue with our next news video now. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan issued 9 more presidential decrees this week, making extensive changes to public and autonomous institutions.
On Sunday and Monday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan issued 9 more presidential decrees, making extensive changes to public and autonomous institutions. With the new decrees, more than 52 institutions and associations were redefined, and the structures and authorities of supervisory and financial bodies were changed. The previous presidential decree had abolished all related laws concerning the legal entity of the state theaters and state opera and ballet, which had been interpreted as having shut down the institutions. With the new decree, however, the legal entity of the state's art institutions were reinstated, as their legislative status was linked to the presidential authority, and their directors will now be able to be appointed outside of the institutions. The authorities, duties and organizational structure of the State Supervisory Council, DDK, which had carried out the supervision of public and private institutions except the military and the judiciary, were also changed. The authority of the DDK was redefined as the supreme inspection body of all auditory systems within the state structure. With the decrees, the Central Bank, Ziraat Bank, and Halkbank were linked to Treasury and Finance Minister Berat Albayrak. The Banking Regulation and Supervision Agency, Capital Market Board, Public Oversight Accounting and Auditing Standards Authority, and Central Finance and Contracting Units will also be overseen by Albayrak. In previous laws, the institutions listed above had been related, linked, or affiliated with ministries. With this decree, all bodies have been defined as related to Albayrak. Other institutions include the Revenue Administration and Directorate of Privatization Administration. With this decree, the Saving Deposit Insurance Fund of Turkey was linked to the presidency. The decree also redefined the Higher Education Board and related laws. According to the new decree, rectors will be appointed by the president among candidates who have more than 3 years of experience as a professor. The annulment of articles related to the qualifications of the rectors with the previous decree were also interpreted as an annulment of the requirement of being a professor in order to become a rector.
The 2-year-long state of emergency was lifted this week.
2-year-long state of emergency came to an end on Wednesday amid the introduction of a draft bill that seeks to bring about new anti-terror laws by the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP. But opposition groups say the laws are as oppressive as the state of emergency. The ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, submitted an amendment to existing laws to Parliament on Monday to deal with the fight against terror after the state of emergency is lifted. The draft legislation envisages to keep some measures under the state of emergency law up to 3 more years. The draft bill abolishes martial law in accordance with the new constitution. Under the proposed new legislation, a suspect can be held without charge for 48 hours or up to 4 days in the case of collective offenses. But this period could be extended twice maximum, or up to 12 days, if there is difficulty in collecting evidence or if the case is deemed to be particularly voluminous. Governors will be able to prohibit individuals exiting and entering a defined area for 15 days on security grounds, where the public order or safety has deteriorated or there are serious indications that will deteriorate in such a way that will stop or divert daily life. Governors will be able to prohibit carrying and transporting all kinds of weapons and ammunition, even if they are licensed. For the period of 3 years, officials of the Turkish Armed Forces, Police Department, Gendarmerie, public servants, and workers who have been assessed as members of or linked to terrorist organizations, structures, or groups that the National Security Council has determined as carrying out actions against the national security of the state will be dismissed from their profession.
Main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP delegates announced this week that they have started collecting signatures to hold an extraordinary Congress for a leadership change.
Opposition Republican People's Party CHP delegates have announced that they have started collecting signatures to hold an extraordinary Congress for a leadership change. We hereby declare to Turkey, to our party's authorities and our Congress delegates, our demand to hold an extraordinary Congress for the CHP with an agenda to change the leadership, CHP's Bilecik lawmaker Yaşar Tüzün said at a press conference in the parliament on Monday. In the conference attended by other CHP delegates, CHP members said the Congress delegates have already started to give signatures for the Congress. According to the party statute, over half of the delegates can declare a Congress by collecting signatures. This requires 634 signatures. After the June 24th elections, where the main opposition party received 22% of the votes, the CHP witnessed an in-house debate over the demand for a change in leadership. Dissidents supported party's presidential candidate Muharrem İnce for the leadership post, while İnce has approached the calls for change positively. I will not collect signatures, but I will follow the will of the delegates, he had said previously. Meanwhile, İzmir Deputy Selin Sayek Böke and former Istanbul Deputy İlhan Cihaner, who had previously published a manifesto entitled For the Future, calling on the party to pursue social democratic policies, stated they support the dissidents. While the dissidents are positive to reach the required number of signatures, the party spokesperson, Bülent Tezcan, said the majority of the CHP delegates are unwilling to sign for a change of leadership. The impression we have is these signatures cannot be collected. The important part of the party grassroots think the time is not appropriate for an extraordinary Congress. There is no strong will among delegates for a Congress, Tezcan said on July 16th during the party's Central Executive Board meeting. Some CHP members who oppose the Congress state the party should focus on the upcoming local elections, which will be held in March 2019.
The Second High Penal Court in Izmir ruled this week that U.S. pastor Andrew Brunson, who's being tried on terrorism and spying charges, will be kept in jail pending trial.
Second High Penal Court in Izmir has ruled that Andrew Brunson, an American pastor being tried on terrorism and spying charges, will be kept in jail pending trial. The court decided to continue listening to the testimonies of witnesses in the next hearing on October 12th. Brunson, a Christian pastor from North Carolina who has lived in Turkey for more than 2 decades, was indicted on charges of having links to the Fethullahist terrorist organization, FETÖ, which Ankara blames for the failed 2016 coup attempt, as well as the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. He was detained nearly 2 years ago and faces up to 35 years in prison if found guilty. Brunson has denied the charges, calling them shameful and disgusting. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has expressed his dismay at the ruling on Twitter, calling it a total disgrace that Turkey will not release a respected US pastor, Andrew Brunson, from prison. Trump said Mr. Erdogan should do something to free this wonderful Christian husband and father. He has done nothing wrong, and his family needs him. Furthermore, following the Turkish court's decision, 6 US senators from the Democrat and Republican parties introduced bipartisan legislation yesterday to restrict loans from international financial institutions to Turkey until the Turkish government ends the unjust detention of US citizens, a state committee statement said. The statement also said that such blockage should continue until Turkey is no longer arbitrarily detaining or denying freedom of movement to United States citizens, including dual citizens or locally employed staff members of the United States mission to Turkey. Andrew Brunson was the pastor of the Izmir Resurrection Church, serving a small Protestant congregation in the Aegean town of Aliya, where he is now on trial. The Turkish government says Brunson's case will be decided by the courts, but President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has previously linked his fate to that of Fethullah Gülen, the US-based Muslim cleric Turkey blames for the coup attempt and whose extradition Ankara seeks.
Credit rating agency Fitch downgraded Turkey's sovereign debt rating to BB this week.
The credit rating agency Fitch downgraded Turkey's sovereign debt rating a notch to BB with a negative outlook. This is the second downgrade move Fitch made within the last 2 years. Meanwhile, the negative outlook implies that Fitch will be closely watching the new government's policies. According to the official statement made by Fitch, Turkey's economic policy credibility has deteriorated in recent months, and initial policy actions following elections in June have heightened uncertainty. This environment will make it hard to engineer a soft landing for the economy. Fitch also pointed out that the underlying reasons for Turkey's credit rating are political pressure on monetary policy, high external financing needs, and a low international liquidity ratio, the erosion of checks and balances leading to a political environment with likely adverse effects on economic policymaking. Fitch's downgrade decision came only weeks after S&P's move to cut the country's debt rating. Turkey's annual inflation had hit a 15-year high last month with 15.4%, and the Turkish lira's depreciation with respect to the US dollar has reached 27% in 2018. Meanwhile, Turkey's unemployment rate for the month of April was announced to be 9.6%, which implies a 0.9% year-on-year drop, while the annual industrial production in May was announced to be 6.4%, exceeding market expectations. However, monthly industrial production dropped by 1.6% in May, signaling a slowdown in the second quarter economic growth figures.
The 25th edition of the Istanbul Jazz Festival ended this week with a concert by Robert Plant.
I will close my eyes.
The 25th edition of the Istanbul Jazz Festival ended with Robert Plant and the Sensational Shapeshifters, the most admirable names of jazz, funk, world music, blues and rock, such as Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Robert Plant and the Sensational Shapeshifters, Benjamin Clementine, Melody Gardot, Avishai Cohen, Dave Holland, Zakir Hussain, and Chris Potter met the festival audience between June 26th and July 17th. The concerts took place at the most iconic venues of the city along the Bosphorus, such as Beykoz Kundura, Sakıp Sabancı Museum, and Esma Sultan Mansion, coupling exceptional sights with the festival joy. One of the hallmarks of the festival, a single-night music marathon, Night Out, gave the stages on the Aegean side of the Bosphorus to the most promising independent artists of the local scene in 9 different venues.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Turkey next week.
Chill Out Festival visits Bodrum for the 4th time this weekend. Kaim, Eli Light, Yori, Lowenthal, Luca Musto, Lum, Mimi Love, Mira and Chris, Schwarzwalder, Stavros and Viken Arman will be on the decks at Zuma Yalıkavak on July 20th and 21st. 2018 will also see Chill Out Festival visiting Çeşme on August 11th and Istanbul on September 15th and 16th.
Dona, dona, dona, dona. Dona, dona, dona, dona. Dona, dona, dona, dona.
Folk legend Joan Baez will be in Istanbul this weekend as part of her world tour for Whistle Down the Wind. She will take the stage at the Harbiye Open Air Theatre on July 22nd. Here are some movies not to miss in theaters this weekend. Mary Shelley describes a love story between Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin and Percy Shelley, writer of popular romantic poems, and Godwin's writing the novel Frankenstein afterwards. Directed by the Saudi Arabian director Haifa Al-Mansur, the script was written by Emma Jensen, and it stars Elle Fanning, Maisie Williams, and Stephen Dillane. Directed by the Saudi Arabian director Haifa Al-Mansur, Mary Shelley tells the troublesome story of two lovers. Mary Wollstonecraft's family disapproves when she and poet Percy Shelley announce their love for each other. The family is horrified when they find that the couple has eloped, accompanied by Mary's half-sister, Claire. While staying in the home of Lord Byron at Lake Geneva, the guests are challenged to write a ghost story, which leads Mary to conceive her novel, Frankenstein. Terminal by Vaughn Stein features Margot Robbie, Mike Myers, Simon Pegg, Dexter Fletcher, Matthew Lewis, Max Irons, and Katarina Cass. The film depicts the story of two assassins in the heart of an unknown dark city, a teacher fighting a deadly disease, a mysterious servant, and a curious waitress. The film is Stein's first feature.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.